Hey, you guys, welcome back to the channel. It's me, B. Riley, and this week we're going to do something just a little bit different. We're actually going to go ahead and do 10 of the most underrated guitar players of the 1960s in less than 10 minutes. Let's get down to it. Okay, so what are the parameters with which that we're working on here? Well, what we're doing is we're going to be talking about these artists, these musicians, and to qualify for this list, there's no real nightmare that they must suffer. It is only that for their efforts and for the impact of their work and the amount of influence that they put out over a multitude of other musicians, that was not reflected in their gains or in the recognition of their work. And that's it. Okay, let's get to it. Number 10. First on our list, right out of the gate, is Mr. Larry Parepa of the band The Sonics. Coming out of Tacoma, Washington in 1960, this band was comprised of essentially a few childhood friends and two brothers. And right from the onset, what started off as a cover band quickly advanced into a thing where they were taking songs by Little Richard and turning the wick way up, actually reverting to an almost lo-fi approach that you would find in a studio more in 1955 than in 1965, when most people were trying to find new tactics to bring more clarity out of the records. The energy of this band and Larry all playing together was just a staunch reminder of the time that the Sonics were one of the few bands that managed to have that game and bring it to live performances on a constant basis. They were just that explosive, completely underrated. Unfortunately, they didn't think anybody was listening, so when it all shook out, they quit.
If you look at the list of best-selling records in the entire country, you'll find on almost every list, number one is a song called Sounds of Silence. And we have the two gentlemen with us today. Welcome, Mr. Simon and Mr. Garfunkel. Simon and Garfunkel, everyone.
And it almost wasn't. See, when the song was recorded, it was recorded strictly as an acoustic song. And it never charted. As a matter of fact, the album completely flopped. They've disbanded, the duo split up. Paul Simon went to England, Art Garfunkel went back to Columbia University. A year and a half later, a producer by the name of Tom Wilson had noticed a couple of college kids in Boston and Florida asking for that track, especially as the culture had become more tumultuous, and the song started to resonate with people on an almost anthemic scale. If only they would hear it, Tom Wilson theorized that they would buy it. Tom was no stranger to success, and Gorgoni was no stranger to sessions. Between the two of them, they knocked out the electric tracks in an afternoon, and actually walked it back to the label and had the label greenlight a release for it. Paul Simon was unaware and Art Garfunkel had absolutely no idea, but by the time that they did learn that the song had been reworked and electrified, it was sitting at number one at the Hot Billboard charts, where it stayed in the top 100 for the next 5 years. When it comes to studio musicians, there is no way to ignore the contributions of Miss Carol Kaye, a session player in Hollywood during the golden age of the Wrecking Crew, and essentially had left through improvisation and through a lot of really intuitive playing on both guitar and bass, some of the most memorable lines that you'll find in pop music of the 1960s. The fact that she improvised the Good Vibrations bass line at the beginning of that track, or the fact that all throughout Pet Sounds, she was lending her own particular type of comfort and finesse in guitar and in bass all over those tracks. By the time that 1970 had rolled around, Carol had been on somewhere in the ballpark of quite a few hundred top 10 hits. Hits that literally were sitting at the top of the Hot Billboard charts for sometimes years at a time. Ironically enough, she was actually in the session with Simon and Garfunkel later on, when they continued adding electronic facilities over their old records. Carol Kaye had an imprint about a mile wide and spent most of her time in the 1960s being part of some of the biggest records on earth. Coming in at number 7, the immortal Curtis Mayfield of the Impressions. Now granted, Curtis had not actually released his own solo record until 1970, but his rhythm guitar work was already becoming very, very prevalent in a lot of soul circles, and people were hearing him. As a matter of fact, Hendrix was once asked why he chose a Strat, and the one reason that he said out loud was, is that he saw Curtis Mayfield playing a Strat and loved the tones and loved the type of riffs that he can get out of that type of ergonomically advanced instrument. It was a big reason why I went for it. Curtis was a monumental influence for years and years, and if you've ever sat down and listened to Hendrix's Electric Ladyland, or have you ever been to Electric Ladyland, then you will hear Curtis's influence right there, because that's Hendrix going for that falsetto Curtis Mayfield type of singing while using a lot of his rhythm parts. Curtis Mayfield was a monumental talent that I feel that we just never gave him enough due credit. She influenced the Stones, she influenced the Animals, she influenced the Who, she even influenced Hendrix. And to the very day that she died, she continued influencing people all across the planet. Because when Sister Rosetta Tharpe was too big for the US, she took on the entire planet. This is a celebrity that literally got married to a sold-out crowd at Madison Square Garden. Yet, like so many other artists of the period of the time, bad record deals and bad luck got to the point where by the time that she had passed in 1973, her family could barely afford to put her in the ground. Most musicians these days would tell you about the kind of panic attack that they might have if they were standing next to Donald Duck Dunn or Booker T as they were playing live in front of thousands of people. But Steve Cropper's cool transcended just his live shows and stepped a lot into his actual playing styles and his lines. But what you're hearing there in the times of frenetic speed that's being promoted, even before Hendrix, but when we had bands like Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels and bands like that who were playing at a super high rate of speed, Steve Cropper was the opposite, just kind of an open window and a breath of fresh air of what happens when somebody just decides to let all the attitude come forward in their playing. His lines are simple, elegant, graceful. They sometimes sound easy, but when you actually sit down and play them, you realize that the finesse is a little bit more difficult to grasp. So Steve Cropper comes in at our list at number 5 today for being the Stax house guitar player with such artists as Aretha Franklin and Otis Redding, Sam Cooke. You just cannot argue over the fact that as many people that do know Steve Cropper's name, that it's just not enough to justify the amount of impact that this player has had and the amount of records that he has contributed to.
I can play blues, you know, and I can feel it in a way. Man, those guys are a different story. That's a different thing altogether. But you can quote me on this, man. Butterfield's something else. He feels it, he's in there all the way. Butterfield is a blues singer. There's no white bullshit with Butterfield. White colored thing with him. I mean, he's there. If he was green, it wouldn't make any difference. If he was a planaria, a tuna fish sandwich, Butterfield would be into the blues.
And that's just who Bloomfield was. Because even though Mike Bloomfield did wind up playing with Dylan and playing with the Electric Flag and playing with the Butterfield Blues Band and essentially becoming a living legend, the truth of it is that he never spent any time actually talking about himself. He was a perpetual fan who used to follow around other musicians to try to see if he could pick up some riff or some piece that he was going on. Mike Bloomfield succeeded in many different things, but one of those things was hanging on to that teenage optimism that you find in rock and roll and blues artists of that age. Just that kind of, that stoke, that fire, whatever it is that gets people excited to play all day and all night. Bloomfield was that guy. And maybe, sure, he had an easier life than some of his heroes, but he paid for it in later years through some issues with addiction and some downfalls in his career. But when it all shakes out, we cannot ignore the fact that Dylan saw something in Bloomfield, snatched it up, caught a bit of lightning in a bottle, and Mike Bloomfield helped push Dylan right over the ragged edge when he went electric at Newport in 1965. Though years later he would fall off of the charts after having a really excellent success with Super Sessions, with Stills, Bloomfield managed to stay current and managed to continue progressing as a player right up until February 15th, 1981, when unfortunately he stepped off this mortal coil.
Fleetwood Mac is really beginning to catch on in America. I'm sure you can sense this, but people are really excited about your new single. I was talking with some of the behind-the-scenes people earlier. They were telling me that the single is like #1 in England.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh Well, parts 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Really nice, really nice. Been playing a lot on WABX, of course, and
Yeah, good.
I don't know if it will be #1 here. I think the Archies will still, sort of push you guys out of the picture. A
Yeah,
little
they
bit.
gave us a lot of trouble in England too.
Regardless of the clouded landscape that was 1967 to 1970 as far as blues rock artists, Peter Green still always managed to keep his toe just a bit higher than everybody else, especially when noticed by artists like B.B. King, who once said of Peter Green, "He's got the sweetest tone I've ever heard, and he's the only man that makes me sweat." And when B.B. King is turning around and talking about your prowess as a musician, then at some point, you've got to admit, you made it. So between 1967 and 1970, Peter Green, fronting Fleetwood Mac, managed to put out some of the most blistering blues rock that was coming out of England at that time. You're talking about a period of time where Cream was out, where The Experience was out, where you had a multitude of power trios, and it was just a little bit more difficult back then to be able to get the lion's share of those record sales. But when it all shakes out, Peter Green still stands as a monumentally underappreciated musician that may have been overshadowed if the guy just wasn't busy enough making his own light. He was asked to be the guitar player for the Rolling Stones before Mick Taylor, and he turned it down because they didn't want him to sing on the records. He was asked to be the lead singer of Led Zeppelin, and he turned that down because he didn't want to put away his guitar. Steve Marriott's voice was soulful, excruciating, absolutely forceful, and blisteringly loud when he wanted it to be. He was an extraordinary and dynamic performer who could be whimpering and soft, but monumental and ironclad a moment later. Unfortunately, a series of poor choices led Steve Marriott back to a path in which he was playing pubs and nightclubs in London towards the very end of his life. But at one point, Steve Marriott was such a raw and absolutely unfiltered talent that bands like Zeppelin and the Stones wanted whatever Steve had, and they wanted it all. When he went ahead and abstained from joining those bands and formed Humble Pie after leaving the Small Faces, and ran that from 69 till about 75, one could potentially view it as a bit of a step backward from the Small Faces, who were such a purist mod effect. But the truth of it was that Steve didn't care. As long as he was playing, he was happy. Vicious, fast, dynamic, cutting, and explosive are phrases that you could only begin to emphasize the talents of Mr. Alvin Lee, the guitar player and the singer from 10 Years After, a band that essentially had been moving and was well noted all throughout the United States and England, but at their performance at the 1969 Woodstock Festival, when Alvin Lee essentially erupted on stage almost violently against his own guitar, screaming and howling like some sort of possessed nightmare, there were seldom few people in the crowd that couldn't be swept up into the absolutely infectious energy of this guitar player. And granted, sure, 10 Years After did get big. 10 Years After did sell a bunch of records, especially when I'd Love to Change the World had come out. But the thing of it is that you just can't dig deep enough on Alvin Lee, because the more you dig into it, the more you find a person who, for all of his politeness and for all of his professionalism, was as haunted and nightmarish on stage as a person could possibly hope for the cost of the ticket or a trip to the record shop. Well, guys, there you go. You've got your top 10 underrated guitar players of the 1960s. And I know we threw some session players in there too as kind of a bit of a curveball. But you want to know what? They are just as responsible for the quality of those records as anybody else who's shaking a tambourine or standing at the front near a microphone. And you guys and gals probably appreciate that more than anybody, because being the guitar players, we're not always the ones who get the credit. So there's that. If you disagreed with the list, great. Throw down your input right down at the bottom. Obviously, of course, I overlooked a bunch of guitar players. You've got so many millions of people back then throwing music together that there are bound to be some corners in which the light just does not fall. So go ahead and throw some names down into the comments section if you got somebody you missed. And at no point is this some sort of irrefutable top 10. These are the unquestionably most underappreciated guitarists of the 1960s. The truth of it is that this is merely 10 very, very, very qualified and talented human beings who made their mark on music, and you know, they just need another pat on the back, because to be brutally honest, their art stands the test of time. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the list. We're going to get back to projects and reviews starting next week. This week, unfortunately, I had to take off because I've had COVID for the last 2 weeks, and breathing and talking and doing work right now is a bit of a stretch for me, which is also why you might hear that my voice is a bit congested. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the list. Thanks so much for stopping in. Thanks so much for subscribing if you already have. And if you haven't, please consider it. We're going to have a lot more of this type of subject material coming up. Going to be talking about a lot more guitars, and actually going to be starting to get into some of the new stuff that's coming out for home recording. You know, some of the interfaces that we can use with iPads and iPhones and things like that. Been looking into that a lot more lately, especially because as it relates to using it for the vids. Anyway, I know we ran over 10 minutes. Well, I lied. It wasn't 10 minutes or less. I'm really sorry about that. But if you've already subscribed, you know that my videos don't run under 10 minutes anyway. Have a beautiful evening. Enjoy your weekend, and you know, go play good and loud. I'll see you guys.